In this video, I interviewed Tanner Linsley, one of the giants in the ReactJS ecosystem. Tanner is the creator of many famous React libraries, including React Query, React Table, React Virtual, React Charts, React Form, and React Ranger. His code is being used by some of the biggest companies in the world, including Amazon, Facebook, Microsoft, Uber, Google, PayPal, Walmart, and many more. In this interview, we discuss some of the current trends in React and web development, and dive deeper into Tanner's perspective on a few key topics: building great user experiences, building beautiful and performant data visualizations and dashboards, ideal component architecture, and working with large data sets in React apps. Please enjoy. There's an outline of this interview in the description below. Feel free to jump around to whichever section is most interesting for you. And now, some snippets from Tanner.
You know, your 7 times 24 data points times 10 series down a chart. And we have, sometimes 5 or 6 charts on a page. It's amazing to see Next.js and Remix kind of forge into this land of extreme performance. And I'm excited for them to maybe circle back around. You can easily go from here's a static table to say, well, I really wish I could sort that table. And as soon as you get into that, you're already venturing into the realm of memoization. You're going to need to think, what if they want to multi-sort? How do you determine directional sorting? That affords its way into filtering as well.
In this episode on the Retool channel, we're interviewing Tanner Linsley. Hey, Tanner.
Hi.
And so I'd love to just start out with maybe just a little bit of context on how you came about building these different libraries like React Query, React Table, React Charts. Like, what led you to create these?
It feels like a lot of this necessity, right? In the beginning, I was like a kind of a leecher of open source, just kind of using anything that I could find to make my job easier. We were building a new business, a new startup that needed a lot of charts and tables and data manipulation stuff. I had no idea what I was doing. So open source was a fantastic way to kind of stand on the shoulders of giants, But after a while, those tools that I was using weren't really fitting my use cases and my needs the way that I wanted them to. And I feel like it's kind of the circle of life, right? That you find a tool and it's amazing until you kind of stretch its capabilities a little bit. And if things are set up good, then usually the library you're using will just kind of grow with you and update, and the maintainers will kind of keep up. But sometimes that's not the case, and to me, that's an indicator that something new could be built. And I didn't necessarily build these libraries thinking, oh, I'm going to build these libraries because I want to have an open source library. I want to have all this extra maintenance and time on my plate. It really was a means to an end for the projects I was working on. I just needed something that was going to solve my problem at Nozzle at the time. And so that's what I built. And open sourcing it was more of a side effect of, we didn't have a lot of employees. Sometimes for a little while, it was just me. So open sourcing it was almost like outsourcing, things that would be difficult for a one-person team. Testing and finding all the different use cases and finding all the bugs. So originally, that's why I built a lot of these libraries. And I'm just glad that they have become more mainstream, Yeah,
and that's a really cool way that you can use open source as a force multiplier in the current day and age, and create this really symbiotic relationship where everyone's benefiting. And just for some context, so you're building Nozzle, and I'm just going to pull this up on my other screen here. And I think it might help with some of these things. You're saying, you built some of these libraries because you needed the functionality. Could you tell us a little bit about Nozzle?
Yeah, Nozzle is It's all about search ranking analytics. So imagine a big kind of Venn diagram, right? And inside of one bubble, you have marketing, and inside of that, you have SEO.
Mm-hmm.
And inside of SEO, you have rank tracking, which is this kind of niche, but in our opinion, very important market of tracking where you and your competitors rank and why. And really tracking anything, monitoring anything about Google search results over time. So anytime you type in a keyword into Google and you get that big, potentially 100 item list of results in Google, along
Mm-hmm.
with all the little tiny strange things that Google's trying out here and there, we are tracking all of that across, hundreds of thousands of keywords at varying intervals every day, every month. So, and
Yeah.
deciphering all of it into a big data warehouse that we can query and offer up to our users as you know explorative analytical data.
Yeah. So a lot of data, and I was
Yeah, it
just
is.
showing on my screen here, and so you're building some pretty cool different front end functionalities around charts and data tables, and so I'm assuming you're going really deep into managing and displaying this data and doing it in a way that's high performance.
Yeah, and we aren't necessarily a data visualization or dashboarding company, something like Tableau or a data studio or anything like that. But because of the unique nature of the data that we have, we do have to take on a lot of that responsibility uh, to display that data correctly. Where existing, existing tools like that probably wouldn't do the data justice. So.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and so it's a really good lead in to um, of what your tech stack is, but also like why you're kind of pushing forward, like where you're feeling the sort of pressure to like develop more and create custom tools. Assuming that's some of the motivation with some of your open source projects. And so, just to zoom out a little bit, can you tell us about kind of your stack and how you're thinking about the sort of architecture of the system? Um, and then at some point, I
Yeah.
want to get into kind of like the general trends around React in the current day and age. But yeah, I guess whatever comes to you first in that question.
So I think a common question I get is, what is Nozzle built with, right? And the answer to that is a two-pronged answer, right? Because I think a lot of people assume that when you're building a company, just everything's kind of built in this one stack, right? But in reality, I think a lot of companies have different tools built on different stacks for different reasons. For example, our marketing site is just that. It's just our, marketing website that has it's built with Next.js currently. Um, we need the performance of SSR. We need the SEO that SSR allows us to have, and um, so marketing site is very much oriented towards that the edge performance that we need. On the other side of it, we have an application that is Nozzle, the app, right? And it has completely different requirements than our marketing site does. We don't care about first page, first contentful paint times or anything like that. It's big bundles, code split stuff. None of it's SSR. It's an SPA. It almost behaves more like an Electron app running in the browser, like an application, than it does like a website, right? So for that reason, we use very different stacks for each of those. And for the most part, I love the tools that are available for the marketing side of things right now.
Mhm.
Next.js is fantastic, kind of always has been for me. I love working with it. And other tools like it, like Remix, is another one that is kind of a hot thing to talk about these days. And they're both fantastic for different reasons. and I would use either of them to build, these kind of outward-facing content sites. But that's not really where I live every day, to be honest. I have some of my employees now are the ones that are managing, the marketing site and more of the content-driven things. I spend most of my time in the app. That you know, so sometimes I can feel a little disconnected from kind of the content world, but that's where most of the tooling around TanStack has evolved. It's inside of this application-driven SPA land. You might notice, like, none of my tools really have much to do with server-side rendering or edge computing
Yeah.
performance. It's all kind of like, what can we do inside of the client? So as far as the front end goes, that's what we use, the two methodologies that we use, and
Mhm.
on the SPA side, we've used a ton of different tools. Today, we're using Vite or Vite.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think it's Vite,
Okay.
but we're using Vite, and it's all client side rendered, and from there, it's just a big amalgamation of kind of TanStack tools. We're using React Query for all of our data fetching, React Location for all of the routing and search param, router state. We're using React Virtual for all the virtualization, and React Table for all the tables, and charts for
Mhm.
all the charts. So, it's a lot of most of my open source uh, library of libraries, I guess you could say, is just a big representation of what I'm using at Nozzle today. So,
Yeah, and that makes total sense. So to zoom out a little bit from there, just and for other React developers that are watching this, what do you see as some of the major trends in the React ecosystem um, today?
I think major trends within, like, even just web development in general is just more specialized tools, specialized stacks, and frameworks for achieving different goals. you know, I feel like the further we go down kind of into frameworks, the more we're seeing more care being put into the specific goals that we have as website developers, right? And the majority of us are creating websites that are content websites that are out, globally accessible to everybody. And there's very important things to consider for every single user: bandwidth, speed, performance. And frameworks like Next.js and Remix are pushing the limits on how we write those kind of applications. And I think they're just going to keep going deeper and deeper into how fast can we get, uh, how much performance can we eke out of the infrastructure we have, that is the internet. um, I think that's fantastic. And if I'm building a website that falls into that category today, uh, I think tools like that are amazing. And it's not just within inside of React either. It's kind of a movement across all of the web frameworks. Whether it's Svelte, or actually, I don't know if Angular is kind of in this realm at all, but I feel like Svelte and Vue, and even Solid.js, which is really intriguing to me, are all kind of looking towards this new generation of framework that will allow this amazing experience for kind of like the edge computed user. Um, I feel like that is kind of where everybody's heads are today. Um, that's not necessarily where my head is, because, like I said, I don't really live in that world most of the time. I'm living more of an application world, so it can feel a little lonely sometimes. I will admit. I feel like, when I say, "Oh yeah, I have an SPA and I don't server side render this application," I kind of get looks and I get scoffed at a little bit, kind of like, "Well, how dare you? Like, how could you not be taking advantage of these new tools?" Um, and when it comes down to it, there are a lot of applications, uh, like mine, and apps that kind of just need to exist inside of this world that isn't following those trends,
Yeah, and
and it's
I
okay. you know?
And I could see those types of applications continuing to grow. It's especially as you have better back-end rendering engines, and at some point people are going to need to continue developing these front-end capabilities.
Yeah,
And so-
I'm very interested in kind of the cross section of the two. You know, I think it's amazing to see Next.js and Remix kind of forge into the this land of extreme performance, and I'm excited for them to maybe circle back around eventually and say, okay, now that we've kind of forged this path and it's a great experience for the majority of the people, let's look back at all of kind of our SPA friends that are still in this world where their requirements are not technically the same. There's not as much motivation to, to move an entire complex system like these big SPA apps over to, an SSR system. How can we sway them? What can we do to improve their lives as well? And that's an area that's really intriguing to me. I think it will happen eventually. I don't know if it's going to happen anytime soon. Um, but for the time being, that's kind of where I'm at. I'm just really focused on the experience my users are having after they've loaded the application and after we have kind of jumped over all the hoops that that people like to optimize for.
yeah,
I'm very interested right now in the user experience of ongoing long sessions. How do charts behave? How do tables behave? And
yeah.
the life cycle of data over time, like really big queries. Of bringing in megabytes of data and
Mhm.
being able to sift and sort and filter through it.
Yeah, so going into that, what are some of the biggest challenges you faced while building Nozzle or otherwise, in terms of working with large sets of data on the front end, with um, working with different data models, or building components that can handle that set of data? And this might be a good time to go a little bit deeper into some of the other libraries you've put out. I know
Yeah,
um, React Virtual helps with some of that. But I'm curious to hear the sort of story of some of the challenges you faced along the way, and what's led you to develop what you
yeah.
have developed.
Well, the first challenge that we faced at Nozzle was creating charts uh, and creating a lot of them on the screen at one time. And in the very early days, we tried a bunch of different solutions. People probably haven't even heard of it, but we've used tools like C3 and Crossfilter. Actually contributed to Crossfilter for a little bit and built some tools around it. Um, After that, that was all powered kind of just by D3, and the D3 ecosystem was still growing and kind of maturing too. Um, and then there was a really large portion of time where I spent working on ChartJS. And I discovered ChartJS when it was, in version 1 and just kind of gaining a lot of traction. But the main developer, the creator of ChartJS, had kind of stepped away for a break, and I didn't know if he was coming back. I started trying to help ChartJS kind of stay up to date and build some new features. Another individual, another friend, Everett Timberg, and I kind of decided to try and step up and take ChartJS to its next generation, its next iteration. So together, we kind of started building ChartJS 2.0, and we built that with our constraints in mind as well. And so my constraints were like Nozzle. How can I fit as many charts on the page at once? And how much performance can we eke out of the canvas? And we sure got a lot of performance out of the
Mhm.
canvas, which you can usually do. Uh, we spent a lot of time working on it, and it was a lot of fun.
And what were some of the optimizations you had to make in terms of working with the canvas to handle this amount of kind of display logic and data? And I'll just pull up on my screen here.
Well, what's interesting here is this still isn't. This is React Charts, not Chart.js.
Yeah.
Uh, and all of React Charts is actually using SVG, so we're not using Canvas
Okay.
yet. But in ChartJS, it was just a lot of recreating a lot of the drawing utilities that you kind of get with SVG,
Hmm.
and to some extent recreating some of the primitive like functions that D3 has. There was also a lot of work to be done in the animation sphere. You don't have like CSS animations at your disposal in the canvas. Everything has to kind of be driven by request animation frames. So it was really it's really interesting to move out of the DOM and into kind of a pixel based environment that you do things in the canvas that you would never think you would have to do, like writing hit detection scripts, and
Right.
using quadratic trees to find out where people clicked and where things are moving around, and you have to kind of recreate layering and things that you normally get for free with the DOM. Honestly, it was a big pain. And it's one of the reasons that I decided I wanted to move away from the from Canvas eventually. So ChartJS was amazing, and I used it for a long time, but eventually I wanted something more native to React that kind of felt like using ChartJS. I liked the declarative nature of ChartJS, but I wanted it to be very React friendly. And that's how React Charts came to be. And it's technically still in beta because I haven't added documentation for it. But we've been using React Charts in production for a while now, and it's been really great.
Yeah, so docs coming soon.
Yeah. So React Charts is built similarly to a lot of other React D3 libraries. We are using D3 for all of the computational stuff. So all of the layout and calculations of scales and coordinates, colors, everything like that is going through D3 utilities, but all of the rendering is happening through React. So instead of using the axis component from D3, we're building our own axis component using React, and then applying those the model that we get from the D3 utilities onto those charts. The way that it works too is you don't have to think about D3. You don't have to think in terms of D3. It's somewhere between using a tool like Vega and observable plot from HQ and raw D3. So, some of it is a declarative and implied, but it's not necessarily the grammar of graphics style yet, like Vega or observable HQ. So kind of somewhere in the middle, but yeah, you just model your data as a series of datums and kind of let React Charts do the rest.
Differently knowing what you know now after building out React charts and working with ChartJS. Any sort of major lessons along the road?
Yeah, I would say if you're going to use, I don't know, if I could go back in time, it wouldn't really help because the libraries that I would want to use only exist really today. There's some libraries that are very intriguing. Like if you are really, really attached to using React for everything, it will probably throw a kink in your setup. You're going to have to use tools like VX, or you'll have to use something that has formed that union of React and D3. If you're willing to let go of React a little bit and give control of your data visualizations to another system, I really am intrigued by tools, by specifically observable plot by HQ. So this is a tool developed by the same team that works on D3. And I believe they're a consultant agency now, but they've developed this library that is really built to explore your data, and make it really easy to explore data. It's definitely worth checking out for anybody who is into data visualization. Observable plot, I think, from Observable HQ. So, uh, you know, maybe that lesson learned within that recommendation would be, find a system that will let you describe your data visualizations kind of with the grammar of graphics, if you will, like find a way that will get you away from implementation detail and imperative scripting and into, here is my data and here are the graphical operations I want to perform on that data to explore it. And then, have use a tool that will take you from, that point A to point B of actually drawing it and getting the result that you want.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm sure a lot of people that are just starting to dip their toes in this sphere can learn a lot from that.
Yeah, and honestly, the easiest way to learn that is just go find a D3 visualization that you think is cool and look at the code that it takes to implement that visualization. You can put it into a component in React pretty easily, but when you want to start updating it and changing it, man, you can go from, not needing a library to needing everything to be just kind of this nice library. So don't reinvent the wheel unless you have the time and really want to get up to your neck in D3 and data viz stuff. It's you can easily drown in it. I'm serious.
Yeah, I'm sure. So outside of the sort of more visual side of things, what are some of the learnings that have maybe come up with like tables, data grids, other types of components on the front end?
Tables are weird because a lot of us, if you learn HTML, you're like, oh, I can make a table. It's you end up just kind of throwing together some HTML table elements, and then you're like, oh, I have React. I can kind of script through, or I just have a framework. You can just kind of script through your columns and your rows and create this coordinate system, right? But again, it's a very quick, slippery slope down to wanting to organize how those tables are created. Um, you can easily go from here's a static table to say, well, I really wish I could sort that table. And as soon as you get into that, hey, I want to sort this table, you're already venturing into the realm of, okay, well, now you're going to need to think about memoization of that data. So you're not computing that sort all the time. You're going to need to think, what if they want to multi-sort? How do you determine directional sorting? Um, that affords its way into filtering as well. So, the more you want to do with your tables, just quickly, like the quicker you start approaching a system that starts to feel like Excel. And some of the concepts of Excel can kind of contradict with the concepts of React. Like you start getting into data grids where, the cells themselves are very reactive and need to affect other cells. And, you can change one value in the table and everything else in the table can change too. So tables can get really complex very quickly. And but even if they're not super complex, even if you're talking about just sorting, filtering, maybe expanding some rows or grouping, and even pagination, like those concepts, while simple to think about, um, are hard to manage on a large scale, especially when you have anywhere between tens or maybe hundreds of types of tables throughout your system. You need to have an organized way to build those tables. So I created React Table as a way to let you define almost like a schema. Here's a table schema, columns and rows. How are these cells derived? Their underlying values, and how are they rendered? So you can kind of create templates that are used for every single column to render those cells, and it's a way to keep things dry and not repeat too much code in your templates. But it's also a way to kind of, just like React charts, you just supply the data that you have and define the parameters that you want the table to operate by, and React table will do the rest. It will handle the sorting and the optimizations and the filtering and the filter options for you. It handles all of the what rows are showing for pagination. Um, and the nice thing about it too is it's headless. So this, I'm sure we're going to talk about headless UI, but headless UI essentially means you can render this data model of this table however you want. So it's very flexible. And yeah, I feel like if you're building a table that has anything beyond just a static HTML table, like you're going to want a tool to help you model that. And that's what React Table is. It started out as a component. It eventually went headless, which is great. I got to get rid of like 90% of the support requests in my GitHub repo.
Wonderful.
And yeah, it's and I'm currently writing version 8 right now. It's a complete rewrite in TypeScript. That is, I was just working on the column resizing logic last night. So yeah.
Yeah, it's cool. Well, I hope anyone listening to this goes and checks it out. I'm curious if you could zoom out on the headless UI concept and the thought of that as a kind of a design methodology for the system, and just share more about where it comes from and more of the philosophy around that.
Yeah. Honestly, I can't take credit for discovering it on my own. I think the first place that I saw it was from Kent, C Dodds. A good friend of mine lives here close to me, but we've kind of been, learning from each other and kind of growing in this ecosystem together. And one day he introduced this headless UI concept to everybody in his downshift library. And I don't think he maintains downshift anymore, but it was a component that was used uh, to render select and autocomplete dropdowns. And it was really cool because downshift didn't actually render any UI for you. It was at the time, this was before hooks. It was a render prop component. So you would give it your options, give it your value, give it all of your state, and then it would give you a render prop that you would then apply to whatever UI you wanted to render. So you were in charge of actually rendering the select box and the option elements, or like a custom div and the div elements and the option box that pops up, right? And it would provide you the model and the state and also another concept that I really like called prop getters, that it would offer you the props that you need to put on whatever elements you wanted. And by doing it this way, it allowed people to, one, they could use whatever UI they wanted. If they wanted to use some material UI select component, they could. If they wanted to build their own, they could. Bootstrap. It didn't matter what UI components or styles people wanted to use because they were fully in charge of the markup and the styles. But the logic was owned by Downshift. And that's the first time that I heard of headless UI. And when I started reading into it, it just made a lot of sense. You know, it's a strange area where you're creating a tool that is specifically meant to be used for UI, for, in this case, building a select dropdown. But it's doing everything but actually rendering that UI. It's owning all of the state and the callbacks and the logic behind how to run that UI component. So that's what React Table is today. From version 6 to 7, it went headless, and I said, I'm not rendering a table for you anymore. You can render a table element. You can render with divs. Heck, you can even use React Table to power charts if you wanted. So that's also an interesting topic. But headless UI, I think, is really important. And even since then, it's gotten kind of even bigger. Like I think Tailwind, the Tailwind group is also working on some headless UI stuff. They might have even branded headless UI, to be honest. I think they did. But anyways, it's a great concept.
How would you advise people to know when to sort of go down the path of more of a headless UI direction, or where's the sort of jumping off point in your mind?
Yeah, it's kind of hard to tell. There's an evolution that happens when you're building components. I think you'll build a component and then you'll find that you need to repeat that component in other places. You start repeating that component a lot, you're going to probably turn that component's logic into a hook to some extent and kind of share it a bunch of places. And I think that's the an easy point to say, okay, this could be headless, where instead of interleaving all of the logic and the markup together inside of a component, you can say, let's extract out the logic and put it into a hook, and then we have our component, and then now you're free to import that hook in anything else and potentially render it in a different way. And I think that's kind of where headless kind of starts, where components start and headless begins. It's kind of right there. When you start separating your logic from your views into like a very reusable system, I think it's pretty natural to know when you want to do that. I just had a component the other day that I was rendering, probably 50 times across our entire app. And in a few places, I needed to render it differently. It couldn't be a button. It needed to be a link, but it was a very special kind of button/link. And so I took the logic out into a hook and, went back through all the old instances and just imported the hook and applied it to the button. And then on these new instances, I ran the same hook, but applied it to the link. And it, that's how you can kind of migrate from one to the other.
Yeah, that makes sense. Where do you see Headless UI as a theme going, and what do you see as some of the like needed improvements in that system?
Oh, I believe it exists in some places, but one area where I probably eventually will release another library will be around date pickers. I think date pickers are, they're kind of like a drop down select kind of a thing. They have a ton of logic that
Yeah.
sits inside of them. And if you search for date pickers right now, you're going to find a dozen of them,
Hmm.
but they all are kind of locked down to the way that they look, or the way that you can customize the way they look is just like
I've had so many bad experiences with date pickers.
and this is why every company has their own date picker. They're like, yeah, right, we're just going to build our own. So they go and build their own.
Yeah.
And that's what I did too. I'm like, I'm going to build my own, but I'm going to build it headless. So like I have a hook called use date picker in Nozzle, and it has a bunch of cool stuff in it that is not ready for prime time yet. But at the end of the day, I just take that hook and I have just built out, the markup for our date picker. Mine happens to open in a modal, and it technically can have multiple date ranges, which is not something you see every day.
Yeah.
Uh, it has quick pick selections on the left where you can kind of just pick some selections and say, I want to see the last 7 days or the last 30, or I want to see there's a difference between the last 7 days and the last week. So, uh,
Yeah.
those kind of utilities. But
In
it'd
the
be really cool to be able to just distribute that and let people say, oh, I can build my own date picker the way that we need it to look and behave, but all the logic is taken care of by this hook that we don't have to think about.
Yeah, and I imagine so many people will start on a lot of these components and not realize just how much nuance and logic actually exists around the component and
Oh yeah.
around creating the
Date pickers are
experience.
horrendous. They really are.
Yeah.
There's way too much happening in a date picker to like, if I could outsource it to a component that I trusted, I would today. I'd remove all my code and just outsource it. But I
Yeah.
I haven't been able to find one with the reliability and the flexibility, the headless flexibility that I need. So for
Yeah.
today, I'm building my own, and it might not be perfect, but it does work pretty well.
Yeah. Are there other components you've run into that have a similar level of complexity or nuance to them?
Oh, trying to think. Date pickers, tables are one. Select boxes. Obviously, there's downshift. I actually use my own version of it just because I wanted to design my own API for it. So I have a component called use select, use dash select. It hasn't been updated in a while, but it is headless too. Don't use it. You should probably use downshift. But I'm trying to think of anything else. Oh, one that I do have, it's not very common, but multi-range sliders. I don't know if you've ever built like a range slider, right? pretty easy to do with input type range. But as soon as you want multiple handles on that range slider, or kind of custom stuff about that range slider, you're going to need like a custom component for that. So I built a library called React Ranger, and
Nice.
I know that's a good name. I like that one. And it's a headless utility. It's a hook that you supply your data model to, and it gives you back all the utilities you need to build um, range sliders. So it gives you the props for the range track, and it lets you iterate over the handles and position the handles wherever you need. So that's one, like a good simple example that I think pretty much anybody could wrap their head around, like why that's pretty cool. Another one that I built for a friend under just kind of a quick little contract. He needed some help with a component that was kind of like a time range selection utility. So think about kind of like a zoomable ruler, but
Yep.
instead of inches, it's time, right? So you have
Yep.
dates and months, and then if you zoom in far enough, you get into like microseconds or whatever, and you
Yep.
can kind of click and drag and select a
hmm
specific time range, or you can zoom out and have it select even more.
That makes sense.
You can have it snap to certain points, be able to move the range around. So there, which is another utility that would be great for like, big data visualization platform. Or in this case, it was a logging utility. If you've ever heard of Timber, I think Timber.io is what it still is today. Oh, they rebranded to Vector and got acquired by Datadog. But they were like a logging platform. And they were using this component I built for them internally, and it was super cool. I'll have to ask my friend there if he'd be willing to shoot me the link to that again. But it was a lot of fun. I can't remember what it was called, but that was a great example of like one that I was like, oh wow, everyone's gonna have their own way of rendering these things. You might not want to show a ruler; it might just be like a line. So giving people the ability to just kind of have full control over the UI.
hmm
And you can imagine the amount of support requests you would get for if you built a great component like that, but you were in charge of the UI. It'd be like, well, how can I change,
Yeah.
the component? How can I change the UI? I want
Yeah.
to change this. Pretty soon, your component props, your types for that component start to explode because you have to invert control of all of the UI and styles back out to the user. It just gets to be too much. So.
So if you take all of this forward, say 3 or 5 years, what do you think that looks like in terms of this ecosystem? Do you think
Yeah,
there's
hopefully you'll see kind of like here's some great primitives around these concepts. Here's a great date picker hook. Here's a great uh, auto complete
yeah.
selection hook, right? And there's kind of these primitives in the ecosystem, and those primitives might even exist outside of React. And kind of like
hmm
here is universally kind of what we as the web decided, like these are great heuristics for these types of tools. Here's adapters for various frameworks within the ecosystem, and then you'll probably see a subgenre of kind of pre-styled and pre-configured versions of those hooks kind of ready to drop in. So there will be an ecosystem. There should be an ecosystem around like here's the primitives and the great tools for really serious and depth first development to build custom experiences. And then you'll see components that are built on top of those that are taking advantage of those headless utilities, but offer more of like a drop-in, quick and dirty kitchen sink kind of an experience. And that's a great way to approach it, because definitely I feel like there's a lot more people, a lot more people in the bucket of I just need something now and I need it to work, and I don't really care how it looks to a certain extent. Just drop it in. But eventually, a lot of those users, if their businesses or apps, whatever, become successful, eventually they migrate towards that smaller bucket of I love this utility, but I need it to look and feel exactly the way that I need it
Yep.
to. So you need a tool that can kind of that has abstractions that can break away and get chipped away at naturally. And I think headless UI is great at that. You know, at some point, the kitchen sink might have too many opinions for you, and so you can go back and say, well, you know, hey, kitchen sink, how did you implement this? And they'll say, oh, well, if you want to override everything, just start with our source code essentially, and then you can start changing the way that the headless hook is consumed into your markup. I hope that paints. I feel like
Yeah.
that paints a pretty good story for let's make
Yeah.
people very productive, but give them all of the flexibility that they want.
Yeah, and allow them to scale up into like more interesting and nuanced user experiences that are really designed for exactly what they're looking for
And
to
really,
create.
that's what I'm trying to do with React Table version 8 is I want to build really great primitives. React Table version 8, it's all in TypeScript, and I'm building the core even outside of React. It could potentially be adapted into any framework, so it's just TypeScript. And then from there, you adapt it into a framework, you know, to whatever the reactivity model of that framework is. So with React, you'll have, you know, re-rendering hooks, and you know, it'll be triggering re-renders, and then you're into kind of the headless layer, where it's like, okay, I'm inside of a framework, and headless UI is kind of in React, it's like a hook, right? Um, and then there's that layer that you can consume the library at. Or and then after that, after I finish all that, I want to eventually build kind of the kitchen sink library that is like, hey, here's React table UI that is a pre-configured table, very similar to like the old component style, that you just drop it in, you configure it, and it just looks pretty good and works out of the box, you know? And with that ecosystem, I could really serve any user at any of the stages of that table development. You know, I can say, drop it in, use it. Oh, you want to customize the UI? Use the hook. Oh, you want to customize how the logic is used inside of like a framework level at the core? You can use the core functionality of it as well. So I feel like that's kind of like the, you know, that is the, oh, I'm about to drop a really nerdy term here, but that's like the Triforce, right, of UI.
Yeah.
Uh, Trust me, I don't get into like fantasy or like games that much, but I've loved Zelda since I
Yeah.
was a kid. So
Yeah.
you know, Zelda's
I
in my
love that.
mind.
Yeah, and like that's such a beautiful thing though to build the just the library in a way that's accessible all across the different sort of scope of needs that someone's going to have starting out.
And React Query is that way too. It kind of evolved into that. There's a React Query core now that, you know, is powering Svelte Query and Vue Query. It's
Cool.
ironically they have to import React Query still in their source
Yeah.
code. So
How does that feel to know that you've sort of built this thing that sort of slowly grows its tentacles out into all these different directions?
I think it's awesome. You know, I'm proud of what we've been able to accomplish. My my biggest maintainer, he really is kind of the maintainer of React Query now. Um, Dominic Dorfmeister, his handle is TK Dodo. He is just really helping React Query grow to its maximum potential right now. Um, you know, React Query is still very young. It's only been out for, you know, 2 or 3 years, and it's got a long way to go still for kind of reaching that max potential. And I'm really excited about what's coming. You know, React 18 is coming out soon. Um, we are about to release version 4 of React Query, which has some really nice improvements around like network modes, and we're also like right on the cusp of releasing a new React Query course. Um, and I don't know when it's going to be released, but I'll tease it a little bit. I've kind of paired up with some of my friends over at UI.dev, and together, you know, we have created this course that I feel like I've been able to disseminate all of the information that I have about React Query and combine it with like their amazing educational skills to create really this awesome experience. So React Query is still really growing and still has a bright future ahead of it. So
Love that. One thing that we haven't touched on too much was sort of dealing with the kind of interface between grabbing these large sets of data and getting them into the kind of headless UI world. How have you, what have you learned along the way of dealing with large data sets? Um,
you
'Cause I know you've
know,
done some stuff with windowing and pagination.
yeah.
What guidance would you give in terms of how to think about working with large data on the front end with the React?
Honestly, the most important part I think about working with large data on the front end is to not have large data on the front end. Like, uh, really, I think the most important part is knowing that eventually the power of your application and the value that you're going to be able to drive through any large data consumption is not going to be possible without a very robust backend, whatever that is. Whether you're performing all of that work in MySQL or in Node, or in our case, like we do a ton of it in BigQuery from Google, Redshift. I don't know what it is you're using, but eventually you will have to scale out of the browser. There's only so much you can do, distributed in the browser. There's some you can do. Lots of people think, well, it'd be so cool if I could just grab 50 megabytes of data of JSON and throw it into React table and just kind of sift through it all on the front end. And while there are good use cases for wanting to do that, uh, most of the time the performance is going to become an issue. And I feel like it doesn't matter what system you're using, offloading that portion of the work to something on the back end becomes crucial. That doesn't necessarily mean though that the front end is off the hook. And I think that's where there's a little bit of a disconnect when you're talking about these large data systems. It's very much a tango, a song and a dance between the back end and the front end. If a good way to think about it is that the front end is responsible for maintaining and handling uh, this huge and usually complex state around data exploration and querying, right? Whether you're performing raw SQL queries or you've got your own custom API or DSL, doesn't really matter what you're doing, but the state needs to live with the user. And so the interfaces between a front end and a back end, that state needs to be extremely first class and understood between both systems, to be able to kind of transport that state to the back end and have the back end perform this computation in the most performant way possible and ship back to the front end as the fewest amount of bytes possible to show what you want, right? And when you break charts and tables down into their most raw form, we're talking about cells inside of kind of a matrix of possible values. You start getting into terms like metrics, aggregations, sub-aggregations, post-aggregations. You've got sorting and multi-sorting models that are going on, like ascending and descending and ordering and limit. Then you start, layering on things like windowing, which kind of multiply the complexity of your queries. And then you're going to want to do comparisons. So how do you do comparison queries where you take the results of two queries maybe across different time periods or metrics and kind of layer them on top of each other to compare. So you you can see how a lot of it will quickly boil down to how powerful is your API to let you express those requirements and say, I requested these three metrics with these permutations of aggregations and sub and post aggregations, and that data comes back to you in exactly the form that you need. There's kind of like a theoretical overlap with GraphQL to some extent. But I feel like GraphQL might, that might dirty the discussion a little bit because you don't need GraphQL to do this. But it is very much, what is the language of your API for querying? How granular can you be with the data that you need to come back, right? And the faster, the smaller you can get those payloads, the better everybody's lives are going to be.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. So much of it goes into sort of understanding the requirements and then designing the interface around those requirements.
Yeah, it's funny. I just thought of this as like a lot of people are like, "Oh, React Virtual is great. I can virtualize these really long lists," And I get people asking me a lot, like, "Oh, I need questions about React Virtual, or how do I do this and that?" And I know React Virtual is there. I use it for some things, definitely, but there's so many use cases where I see people using virtualization where I'm thinking you should be using pagination, you know, because if you're fetching 500,000 items from the backend to virtualize all at once, like unless you're using incremental pagination underneath the virtualization, like there's kind of this weird there's this weird permutation inside of that use case where it's kind of like, instead of virtualization, you should be using pagination. And I think the most of the time I would talk about virtualization would be around like infinite scroll, or even just in the case of like maybe you only have like 20 or 30 items, but virtualizing one or two of them at a time can save you performance. Like we do that. We have some widget blocks that are pretty intensive, and we only want to render the ones that are on the screen at any given moment. We only have like 10 or 20 in the query, but your performance takes a hit when you try and render all those at the same time. So it's like rendering, I think it's like if you were to render 20 of these projects at one time, it'd be like 200,000 data points through SVG rendered on the screen. It doesn't make sense. So
Too big of a load.
yeah.
Have there been any specific instances where you've maybe thought you could have rendered something, or you've bumped into a wall where you kind of maybe weren't anticipating it in your building of Nozzle?
Absolutely. I just went through a big overhaul probably over the last couple months. Uh, we launched it about 2 months ago, where we had to rethink how we were handling like really large data sets across large timeframes. So, BigQuery is fantastic from Google. I don't know if you've ever heard of it or if anybody listening has ever used it, but you can query terabytes of data, like, millions of rows going back through large portions of time, like just in a few seconds. And it's easy to get into situations where you're like, okay, well, I want to see our metrics for the last 90 days. And you say, and I want to, group by this and give me 10 of them. So you'll have 10 lines on this chart, and you think, okay, 10 lines, that's pretty good. But then when you think about each one of those lines having 90 data points being rendered, it's like this starts to get into some designing around data, right? How many samples or data points in a line do you need to do people want to see, right? So we eventually had to we were hitting the ceiling with some people who were tracking their rankings hourly. So imagine someone says, I have these these 50,000 keywords that I care about, but like 1,000 of them are tracked hourly. So every hour we're going out and we're harvesting this information from Google. And so if you bring up 7 days, you're 7 times 24 data points times 10 series down a chart. And we have, sometimes 5 or 6 charts on a page. the
Yeah.
the multipliers are crazy.
Yeah.
So we had to start using sampling. So now we default all of our max samples to 30 samples per query. So even if you're fetching like a year's worth of data, you'll only get 30 sampled points from that date range. And that's a very normal thing to do with
Yep.
systems like this. You'll see that like in Google Analytics, you
Hmm.
know. And there's always ways you can say, you know what, show me all the samples, and it's just like blows up
Hmm.
your browser. And so that
Yeah.
was an interesting one. You really get into the concepts of like data density on a dashboard. You've got so many different layers. You have like, okay, how many widgets do we have? And how many charts and tables are inside of those widgets? How many series are in those tables or rows in those tables and charts? And how many data points going across? And then you can also talk about each individual cell possibly having preloaded metrics behind it. So then you have kind of this Z index of like, okay, you can have like the sum or the average or the 75th percentile, and you can kind of flip between those really quickly. Or do you make new queries for different sub aggregations? So data density and designing an API around data density is really fun, and that's been kind of the longest journey that we're still on. Like I
Yeah.
think I think maybe later today we might even have a discussion about the next version of the API that's going to allow for even more granularity and power. So
Yeah, and it makes sense. There's only more data to scrape and crawl and aggregate and organize. Um, when I first worked out of school at a engineering company that did sensor data acquisition systems, and so we'd be acquiring data from, say 5,000 sensors at 30,000 hertz. So you're getting 30,000 data points, you know, per second.
yeah,
Uh, from thousands of sensors, and you have to have these custom RAID array setups just to store the data, and then these crazy sampling algorithms just to like visualize it without overwhelming the front ends.
all I can say is thank heavens for BigQuery. Like if there's been one technology that has defined like the potential success of Nozzle over the last few years, we wouldn't have been able to do any of it if we didn't have BigQuery. It really
Mhm.
is amazing. Like all of our API, we're microservices and mono repo. Like there's all these different patterns that people talk about. We use Go. Like Go is super cool. It's very fast and it's great for building fast web servers. Um, we're using like MySQL with Vitesse. So if you've ever heard of PlanetScale uses Vitesse on top of like MySQL instances, and it's all managed. We run, Vitesse on top of MySQL in Kubernetes. All these pieces of technology are really amazing, but at the end of the day, we wouldn't be able to deliver our product if it wasn't for Google's BigQuery. There's just no there's very few other technologies in the world that can do what BigQuery does, and we think that BigQuery does it the best so far. Uh, you know, honorable mentions like ClickHouse and Redshift, uh, and I can't remember what Amazon's is, but yeah, like these big data warehousing query languages. Uh, BigQuery is just amazing. It just blows my mind every time that you can run a query that's like, oh yeah, we just scanned 3 million rows for you, and it only took 3 seconds.
Yeah,
it
it's
was
wild.
it was distributed across this many nodes, and
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
bonkers.
it's fascinating. Well, I know we're getting late on the time here. I guess the last thing I'll end with is, coming from Retool, we see people building all sorts of front ends really for quick admin panels, interfaces like that. How do you think about the sort of decision of build versus buy, of whether to build something and how to think about the constraints of when you just need to get it done versus going in and custom building it?
Yeah, I feel like a majority of applications out there, for better or worse, kind of end up being these CRUD applications. It's usually just an interface into a database, and you're setting up forms on top of your models. Um, that I feel like that's what a lot of apps are, and then there's usually some type of a product portion of it too. But when you're talking about like admin panels and internal tools, um, I think it really depends on how much of that you've already built for yourself inside of your application. Like if you have a an app that's basically just CRUD on top of your stuff. If you've built out every single form and every single page to be able to edit every single model in your database and perform operations in your app, then maybe you're very close to having an internal tool already. You just need to kind of change the permissions and the way that it's shipped and what people can do. But I don't feel like a lot of people get there as quickly as they think they will. So at the end of the day, that you have a CRUD system, and really the app that you're building only interacts with a few parts of that. And as an admin, you need way more control to be able to work with your system. And if you find yourself needing those admin tools very quickly, where your own implementations of UI around your database and like administrative layers, if those are going to take a while to catch up, or they just might never even get there, I feel like going after something like Retool would be a fantastic idea. And it doesn't mean, also going with something Retool doesn't mean you have to. It's not mutually exclusive. You could have some views that use Retool and some views that don't. You could have everybody kind of has something custom about them, right? So you could use Retool for everything, and then kind of augment Retool kind of with some of your own custom stuff. And I feel like it's just kind of being honest with yourself about where at what level do you think your app is at, and do you really want to spend your time building like administrative tools? Maybe you have the time and you have the employees, to be able to do that, and that's great if you can. But if you don't have time for that, and you just really need to focus on product and features and getting things done for your users, then Retool could be it can be a huge asset.
Couldn't have said it better myself. But yeah, I think all of that. Yeah, it's spot on for the way we think about um, how engineers should be oftentimes focused on the most important tasks, and get out the internal tooling type stuff as quickly as possible, just to solve these various operational needs internal to an organization.
Yeah, there's a lot of fallacy around thinking that you need to build everything on your own right away. People like to think that the decisions they're making today are going to be permanent for a business
Mhm.
or for a product, when in reality you just need something to work today. Because if you can get something shipped today that earns you another month, then
Mhm.
you have that next month to think about how you can change that solution.
Yeah,
So
yeah, and so often once you implement it, feedback comes in from the end users and other process sort of operants, and then it needs to change and grow, and so it's better to quickly get something out and start using it, and then learning how it needs to change and grow. So
yeah.
thank you so much, Tanner. We really appreciate you taking the time, and also really appreciate all of the work you put into open source and sharing in the React ecosystem. And just really appreciate you chatting with us today.
It's
And
been a lot of fun. I love
looking
talking about
forward.
this stuff.